Well, good evening again, and this is our final lesson in the Book of Esther. We will be finishing out the book tonight and finishing up our study on how this narrative in Esther serves as an illustration of the church's sojourn in the world, or in Babylon, as I like to say. And just what we can expect. And tonight we'll see how it is going to end up. Now we have, up to this point, we have entered into the judgment or end times phase of the parable. Mordecai has been elevated out of suffering and into a glorified position. And so this unifies the type of the church with Esther. Mordecai is no longer the church in suffering, but he has joined Esther as together they are a type of the church in glory. And we're about to see that for sure here in a moment. And in the narrative, we remember that Haman had set about a plan for the destruction of the Jews. But Mordecai was number one on his list, and he had conspired to hang Mordecai on a gallows outside of his house. But Mordecai was saved from that, and Haman was destroyed on his own gallows. But there still remains this problem of the rest of the Jews. And what the king said was going to happen to them. And here, one last time, I'm going to pop up the map of the Persian Empire. You see, it is quite a large area. This is almost as big as the contiguous United States. And while Susa there is pretty much in the middle as far as east-west goes, almost certainly the majority of Jews were probably around Susa or west of it, and there is a remnant that has already returned to Judah. But still, I mean, they're bound to be scattered about. So this is a big area to cover, and there's no electronic communication. There's no mass media of any sort. There's no highways. The idea of building roads in the furthest parts of your empire was a Roman idea. So there's really not much way of getting around, getting word around for these kingly edicts. So that's quite a challenge, and so that's where the action is taking place. And the Bible often speaks of somebody being over all the world. And of course, that's not so. It's in a system like the Persian Empire, that counted as all the world. But it's a way of expressing how difficult it is to penetrate a huge expanse. So it might as well be all the world to try to get the word from a kingly pronouncement into the deepest regions of an empire that's so great. So there's that. So we're going to pick up tonight in chapter 8, and we will start with verses 1 and 2. On that day, King Ahasuerus gave to Queen Esther the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews, and Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told what he was to her. And the king took off his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai, and Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. So the house here is all of the things that Haman had gathered unto himself. And Esther, it says here, reveals her relationship to Mordecai. So now she's flat out telling the king she's Jewish because Mordecai made no secret of it. And now they truly are one and the same. The king elevates uh, Mordecai, and Esther turns over all of the things that Haman had gathered to himself over to Mordecai as well. So this, within the parable, then, this is the church in glory. And the church, as we can see, is given control of all of these things, including the signet ring. So that's a lot of authority to be given by the king. All right, let's go on then to verses 3 through 8. Then Esther spoke again to the king. She fell at his feet and wept, and pleaded with him to avert the evil plan of Haman the Agagite and the plot that he had devised against the Jews. When the king held out the golden scepter to Esther, Esther rose and stood before the king. And she said, "If it please the king, and if I have found favor in his sight, and if the thing seems right before the king, and I am pleasing in his eyes, let an order be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, which he wrote to destroy the Jews who are in all the provinces of the king. For how can I bear to see the calamity that is coming to my people? Or how can I bear to see the destruction of my kindred?" Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, "Behold, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and they have hanged him on the gallows, because he intended to lay hands on the Jews. But you may write as you please with regard to the Jews in the name of the king, and seal it with the king's ring, for an edict written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's ring cannot be revoked." So again, Esther is relying on her relationship with the king. She begins her plea to him with, "If I have found favor." So this is grace. She's depending on grace, and this, of course, is as opposed to Haman, who offered a bribe. So she and Mordecai are given complete authority to do as they please. But the one thing that the king does not do for Esther, as she asked that his ruling be revoked, he says that an edict written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's ring cannot be revoked. And this was a thing with the Medes and Persians. You know, the word of the king stood, and not even he could change it. But so the law here is not removed, but it is superseded by a higher law. The king is going to allow Esther and Mordecai to write whatever they want, and that's going to stand above this higher law. And of course, this is true with the law of Moses. It still stands, but it has been overruled by a higher law, the law of liberty, as James says, or Paul calls it the law of Christ. And this is for the good of the church, that we are not under the law, but we are under this higher law, which is essentially grace. So what they're going to do is come up with this plan that protects the Jews, and most importantly, preserves the line of Zerubbabel, which is in Judah, and carries the seed that leads to the Christ. All right, let's move on then to 9 through 14. The king's scribes were summoned at that time in the 3rd month, which is the month of Sivan, in the 23rd day. And an edict was written, according to all that Mordecai commanded concerning the Jews, to the satraps and governors and the officials of the provinces from India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces, to each province in its own script, and to each people in its own language, and also to the Jews in their script and their language. And he wrote in the name of King Ahasuerus, and sealed it with the king's signet ring. Then he sent the letters by mounted couriers, riding on swift horses that were used in the king's service, bred from the royal stud. saying that the king allowed the Jews who were in every city to gather and defend their lives, to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate any armed force of any people or province that might attack them, children and women included, and to plunder their goods. On one day, throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, in the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, a copy of what was written was to be issued as a decree in every province, being publicly displayed to all peoples. And the Jews were to be ready on that day to take vengeance on their enemies. So the couriers, mounted on their swift horses that were used in the king's service, rode out hurriedly, urged by the king's command. And the decree was issued in Susa, the citadel. There's a lot of detail in that little part of the story. Obviously, it is how the message was sent out throughout this vast empire is one of the details, but also the day, the month, and the day that the edict was written. And this is important. It's important to note the date and time of these things, and this is why we in the creed we say crucified under Pontius Pilate, is to set down in writing in the time and place that the crucifixion occurred. So it is important in historic events, to have that detail, and so they include it. So all the royal accoutrements gave that were added to Mordecai, transferred from Haman to Mordecai. That is what gives this order authority. And it is the same day that Haman's attack was planned, the 13th day of the 12th month. So while the attack on the Jews was allowed for a single day, so also the Jews are allowed to defend themselves for that one single day, defend themselves with impunity. And that's what the law is, simply. The king's edict is that you are to be attacked this day. Now this edict from the king is that you can defend yourself. So the officially decreed death of the righteous is overturned. The edict that allowed the Jews to be slaughtered is overturned, and now the edict it isn't removed, but there is an edict added that the Jews can defend their lives as strongly as they want, and this can be compared to the resurrection. The death of the righteous is overturned. Okay, let's finish out the chapter. Then Mordecai went out from the presence of the king. In royal robes of blue and white, with a great golden crown and a robe of fine linen and purple. And the city of Susa shouted and rejoiced. The Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor. And in every province and in every city, wherever the king's command and his edict reached, there was gladness and joy among the Jews, a feast and a holiday. And many from the peoples of the country declared themselves Jews, for fear of the Jews had fallen on them. So, just as sorrow and grieving met with the first edict, rejoicing, the second edict was met with rejoicing, and the Jews didn't hold back, and they were celebrating in such a massive way that it was a warning to the people, don't touch. And some even converted. Who knows how real that was, but it was a turning of the tables. Okay, so that's chapter 8. Now the parable starts to turn into prophecy as the judgment of angels and the new creation are about to be portrayed in the next 2 chapters. So I'm going to start chapter 9, and I'm going to read 19 verses, so brace yourselves. It's a long passage. Now, in the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, on the 13th day of the same, when the king's command and edict were about to be carried out, on the very day when the enemies of the Jews hoped to gain the mastery over them, the reverse occurred. The Jews gained mastery over those who hated them. The Jews gathered in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who sought their harm. And no one could stand against them, for the fear of them had fallen on all peoples. All the officials of the provinces and the satraps and the governors and the royal agents also helped the Jews, for the fear of Mordecai had fallen on them. For Mordecai was great in the king's house, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces. For the man Mordecai grew more and more powerful. The Jews struck all their enemies with the sword, killing and destroying them, and did as they pleased to those who hated them. In Susa, the citadel itself, the Jews killed and destroyed 500 men, and also killed Parshandatha and Dalphon and Espatha and Paratha and Adalia and Aridatha and Parmashta and Arisai and Aridai and Vaizatha, the 10 sons of Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews, but they laid no hand on the plunder. That very day, the number of those killed in Susa, the citadel, was reported to the king. And the king said to Queen Esther, in Susa, the citadel, the Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men, and also the 10 sons of Haman. What then have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now what is your wish? It shall be granted you. What further is your request? It shall be fulfilled. And Esther said, if it please the king, let the Jews who are in Susa be allowed tomorrow also to do according to this day's edict, and let the 10 sons of Haman be hanged on the gallows. So the king commanded this to be done. A decree was issued in Susa, and the 10 sons of Haman were hanged. And the Jews who were in Susa gathered also in the 14th day of the month of Adar, and they killed 300 men in Susa, but they laid no hands on the plunder. Now the rest of the Jews who were in the king's provinces also gathered to defend their lives, and got relief from their enemies, and killed 75,000 of those who hated them, but they laid no hands on the plunder. This was on the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th day they rested and made that a day of feasting and gladness. But the Jews who were in Susa gathered on the 13th day and on the 14th, and rested on the 15th day, making that a day of feasting and gladness. Therefore the Jews of the villages who live in the rural towns hold the 14th day of the month of Adar as a day for gladness and feasting, as a holiday, and as a day on which they send gifts of food to one another. Okay, so there's quite some emphasis on the fact that the Jews were not interested in taking the material wealth. Their interest was in defending their lives, and that was the end of it. Here we see the destruction of the Jews' enemies is complete. And here we can draw in John chapter 20, verse 23. If you forgive the sins of anyone, they are forgiven. If you withhold forgiveness from anyone, it is withheld. So it is symbolic of that judgment that the church will have in the forgiveness of sins, or perhaps I should say does have, in the forgiveness of sins. And this is our role as little Christs on earth. Now there's some theological depth there which I'm not able to really talk about, but or to understand. But this shows the depth of the authority and responsibility that Christ has given us. So their vengeance, the Jews' vengeance, is based on hatred, those that hate them, and hatred. For the purposes of the parable, hatred of the church reflects hatred of Christ. And here I'm going to bring in Matthew 25, verses 43 through 45. 25, right? I was a stranger, and you did not welcome me, naked, and you did not clothe me, sick and in prison, and you did not visit me. Then they also will answer, saying, Lord, when did we see you hungry or thirsty, or a stranger, or naked, or sick, or in prison, and did not minister to you? Then he will answer them, saying, Truly, I say to you, as you did not do it to one of the least of these, you did not do it to me. So, this is the extent to which Christ identifies with his church, and vice versa. So, the Jews, or rather the world that hates the church, is in turn at the same time hating Christ. Also, we've got Matthew 10:22 that we can read. And you will be hated by all for my name's sake, but the one who endures to the end will be saved. So we should expect to be hated because they hate Christ. So, hate the church, hate Christ, hate the church. It works both ways. Now, this passage in Esther is difficult. The church is so much built on the forgiveness and the mercy of God that when we read about the judgment of God and see examples of that, which are not a few in the Old Testament, it's jarring. And but we can get some help with this through the imprecatory psalms, the psalms that are about praying down judgment upon one's enemies. And the one that is most pertinent to us in this lesson is Psalm 137, and I will read it to you. By the waters of Babylon, there we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion. On the willows there we hung up our lyres, for there our captors required of us songs, and our tormentors mirth, saying, Sing us one of the songs of Zion. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget its skill. Let my tongue stick to the roof of my mouth, if I do not remember you, if I do not set Jerusalem above my highest joy. Remember, O Lord, against the Edomites, the day of Jerusalem, how they said, lay it bare, down to its foundations. O daughter of Babylon, doomed to be destroyed, blessed shall he be who repays you with what you have done to us. Blessed shall he be who takes your little ones and dashes them against the rock. Okay, that's pretty rough there at the end. But as this is the psalm of the Jews in exile in Babylon. It's a lament, but the church can adopt this too because we are in sojourn in Babylon as well. And this is our lament as well as we long for our King, as we long for our home. So who is it that we pray that he be repaid for what has been done to us? Who do we pray that their children, his children, would be bashed against the rocks? Well, we can explore this in other places in the Old Testament, one of those being Isaiah 21, verse 9. And behold, here come riders, horsemen in pairs. And he answered, Fallen, fallen is Babylon, and all the carved images of her gods he has shattered to the ground. Okay, there's Babylon. Babylon is the world system. It is all world systems. And there is a verse in Isaiah about Babylon's fall. We get a similar message in Jeremiah 51:44. And I will punish Bel in Babylon, and take out of his mouth what he has swallowed. The nations shall no longer flow to him. The wall of Babylon has fallen. Another promise for the fall of the world systems. Then also we have it in New Testament prophecy. In Revelation 14:8, we read, another angel, a second, followed, saying, fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great, she who made all nations drink the wine of the passion of her sexual immorality. And then also in chapter 18, verses 2 and 3, and he called out with a mighty voice, fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. She has become a dwelling place for demons, a haunt for every unclean spirit, a haunt for every unclean bird, a haunt for every unclean and detestable beast. For all nations have drunk the wine of the passion of her sexual immorality, and the kings of the earth have committed immorality with her, and the merchants of the earth have grown rich from the power of her luxurious living. So, as the church in captivity in Babylon, we recognize that these are the children of Babylon. Carved images, false gods, demons, unclean spirits, sexual immorality, unclean lives, luxurious living. These are the things that we want their heads bashed against the rocks. Let's remember who our real enemy is, and a horrific, horrible, and just judgment awaits him. Just as Satan's head has been crushed under Christ's heel, so will it happen to those who are his followers and his workers. And this is part, to go back to the first lesson, this is part of Christus Victor, his victory over his enemies. And there really can be no greater goal for the church than to see not our judgment be fulfilled, but God's judgment exercised perfectly against his enemies. And in the end, we will join the angelic rejoicing as we sing along with Revelation 19:3, Hallelujah, for the smoke arises from Babylon forever and ever. Okay, well, let's continue then. In Esther, we'll finish out chapter 9 now. And Mordecai recorded these things and sent letters to all the Jews who were in all the provinces of Ahasuerus, both near and far, obliging them to keep the 14th day of the month, Adar, and also the 15th day of the same, year by year, as the days on which the Jews got relief from their enemies, and as the month that had been turned for them from sorrow into gladness, and from mourning into a holiday, that they should make them days of feasting and gladness, days for sending gifts of food to one another and gifts to the poor. So the Jews accepted what they had started to do and what Mordecai had written to them. For Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to destroy them, and had cast that is, cast lots, to crush and destroy them. But when it came before the king, he gave orders in writing that his evil plan that he had devised against the Jews should return on his own head, and that he and his sons should be hanged on the gallows. Therefore they called these days Purim, after the term Pur. Therefore, because of all that was written in this letter, and of what they had faced in this matter, and of what had happened to them, the Jews firmly obligated themselves and their offspring, and all who joined them, that without fail they would keep these 2 days according to what was written, and at the time appointed every year, that these days should be remembered and kept throughout every generation, in every clan, province, and city, and that these days of Purim should never fall into disuse among the Jews, nor should the commemoration of these days cease among their descendants. Then Queen Esther, the daughter of Abihail, and Mordecai the Jew gave full written authority, confirming this second letter about Purim. Letters were sent to all the Jews, to the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Ahasuerus, in words of peace and truth. that these days of Purim should be observed at their appointed seasons, as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther obligated them, and as they had obligated themselves and their offspring with regard to their fasts and their lamenting. The command of Queen Esther confirmed these practices of Purim, and it was recorded in writing. So again, we've got the importance of recording things according to a certain date, and as a guide for future practice. And indeed, the Jews do still observe Purim. This year it was on March 9th and 10th. And in doing so, they unknowingly celebrate the church's privileged position with God. Just as when they celebrate Passover here in the post-Christian world, they mark the sacrifice of the Messiah that they rejected. So it's another one of those events, types in the Old Testament that lead to kind of a blind testimony among Jews about the work of Christ. Okay, chapter 10. King Ahasuerus imposed tax on the land and on the coastlands of the sea, and all the acts of his power and might, and the full account of the high honor of Mordecai, to which the king advanced him, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? For Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Ahasuerus, and he was great among the Jews and popular with the multitude of his brothers, for he sought the welfare of his people and spoke peace to all his people. So it's a short chapter. So what we see here is that Mordecai's position now is like Joseph in Egypt. He is second only to the king, and it is Mordecai representing the church who speaks peace to the people like a priest. And this speaks of the priesthood of every believer in the church, but also the way that the church has spoken peace to the broader world throughout its existence. The church has had a tremendous influence on civilization, particularly in the West, which is largely being rejected now by Babylon, and that will continue. But the church really has been able to speak peace to the people, and it's not the peace of the land as it was for the Jews, as we know from the book of Hebrews, but the peace of Christ, the real peace that God offers to the world. So that is the study in Esther. If you'd like to read this, there is a version of it on my website, which is right there. It's organized differently. It doesn't go straight through the book, but it handles it more according to the types, and that might help if you're better with reading than with listening. Then that you might find that helpful. There's also plenty of other stuff to see there. So I thank you for joining and looking at this if you are looking at it sometime into the deep future. And I hope that it has been a blessing to you and an encouragement, and will help you kind of expand your view of what the church is all about, and what we are going through and what we can expect in our sojourn through Babylon. So Lord bless you, and you have a good evening.